Welcome, everyone. My name is Heather Knoll, and I am the program coordinator at Sustainable Woodstock. Founded in 2009, Sustainable Woodstock is a not-for-profit community and environmental action and education organization. Our vision promotes vibrant, inclusive, thriving communities where we live sustainably now and in the future. This event is a part of our Green Drinks series. Green Drinks are social events to connect people who have similar interests. We invite local nonprofits, businesses, and individuals to make a short presentation to share their sustainability and green initiatives in our area. And next month, we will have a presentation on the plan for the new Woodstock Net Zero School building, and that will be on January 18th. Now, before we get started with our presentation, I just want to run through how our meeting will operate tonight. As I mentioned before, this meeting is being recorded and you can turn off your camera if you'd like. You are currently muted, and if you have questions, we're going to ask you to type them into the chat box on the side of your screen, and we'll have time to answer questions after the presentation. And feel free to type questions into the chat box at any time during the talk, and we'll circle back to them at the end. All right, now I am very pleased to introduce you to our speaker for this evening. Debbie New is a teacher and anthropologist by training. She has coordinated coalitions and working groups dedicated to clean heat. Debbie launched the Vermont Community Geothermal Alliance in 2022 to support geothermal energy and put thermal energy network solutions on the table in Vermont. Thank you so much for joining us, Debbie. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be with you all, and I recognize some people here, and I'm really glad to meet everybody. So I'm just going to take a second to share my screen, make sure I do this right. Go into slideshow mode. Okay, so I grew up in Burlington, and I raised my family in Waitsfield. I now live in South Burlington, and I am here tonight as the coordinator of the Vermont Community Geothermal Alliance to talk about thermal energy networks for Vermont. So this includes geothermal, but also talks about other kinds of thermal energy that we have right here that we can use. So this is really about moving heat in our communities. So the Vermont Community Geothermal Alliance, or VCGA, was formed last year in order to put the solution on the table in Vermont, with help and support from people in Vermont, local, regional, and state leaders, but also from national experts. So I'm more on the teaching, educating side of things. I'm not a technical expert, but I hope that this presentation will address some of that, and then we can collect what our questions are. The ones I can't answer, I will get answers to. I'm also working with Energy Action Network's Network Action Team on thermal energy networks. There's so many networks in that. You can see from this list the kinds of organizations that are involved. We've been meeting for about a year to talk about this solution and what it could look like in Vermont. And what this team is mainly doing is wanting to support projects. And so the thing that we're doing right now is putting together a toolkit to be released early in 2024, hopefully January, that has resources for municipalities, affordable housing developers, businesses, and others to understand what this is, what we're looking for when we're looking for local heat and where it can be used, and how to develop a project. In other words, what kinds of ownership models apply that we can use locally? What kind of financing opportunities are there? And what would a project look like when it's actually underway? So that I can share with Sustainable Woodstock people when it's ready. So today, here we are at Green Drinks, and I chose this photo of something that maybe you recognize from around Woodstock. I really like knowing that your ice arena is the first net zero rink in the USA, and that is a community center, because those are the ideas we're talking about when we talk about using local heat and creating local heating and cooling solutions for the benefit of the community. So today I'm going to go over the basics of geothermal and the benefits of that, and talk about networks, both geothermal and thermal energy networks, and what that means, like what's the difference. I'll talk about what's happening in Vermont and what's needed to do more. So the geothermal systems we have that are operating already, you may not know where they are because they're largely invisible underground and inside buildings. And then just to touch on the workforce financing and policy needs. And then we get to what we can do locally, what this really looks like for municipalities, for developers to do more. And then hopefully some time for questions. So I want to emphasize that geothermal solutions aren't new. This is not new technology. It's proven, demonstrated, working. But using existing heat is a newer idea in Vermont and in many places. So the other thing is that networks or shared community scale infrastructure also aren't new ideas. We have road systems, we have water systems, but networked heat is a bit newer, especially when we're not talking about district heat from biomass and other kinds of combustible fuels. We know these thermal energy networks won't work everywhere in our more rural state. So our main question is, how can they play a role in the mix of the solutions we need? So we'll come back to that. But first, let's start with geothermal for an individual home. This is not deep geothermal. It's not the hot rocks and hot lava coming directly up into your living room. This is instead shallow geothermal, and essentially what we really should call it is a ground source heat pump loop. So you might be familiar with this. When you turn on your heat, the ground source heat pump inside your house, that box in the basement, delivers warm air and extracts cold air like an air source heat pump. So there's the warm air inside the house that's coming up from underground. In the summer, the process reverses. So the heat pump delivers cooler air and extracts heat returning to the earth. All of this comes from underground at about the depth of a water well. Well, where the Earth's temperature is a constant about 50 degrees. So the water in vertical pipes underground absorbs that temperature and brings it up to your ground source heat pump in your basement. Whether it's concentrated into hot or cold air, depending on what's needed, and keeps you comfortable year round. Excess heat, meanwhile, is sent back underground where it's stored until it's needed. So it's heating, cooling, domestic hot water, and storage. Geothermal can also work well for larger buildings, especially because it's very reliable and low maintenance. Especially for municipal buildings like schools, town halls, libraries. It's a great solution. And it can be an anchor for building a network out from one building and spreading that to other buildings nearby. It's also an important alternative to biomass. So we can come back to that maybe around some questions about it. A network system is even more efficient than geothermal for a single building. So buildings are connected to vertical bores, as I mentioned, and they're linked by horizontal pipes that form closed loops that exchange temperature with the earth and share it between buildings. So homes and large buildings and different kinds of facilities like the ones you see here, this is based on some buildings around Waitsfield, where my daughter who made this illustration grew up. So that's her elementary school. So they often have different thermal needs at different times. So excess heating or cooling isn't wasted. It's not vented out of the buildings or flushed down the drain. It's shared efficiently between them. And these loops can grow over time, becoming even more affordable and more efficient as they grow. But it's important to mention that we don't have to do a network all at once. We can start small and build from there. So this is one of my favorite parts of talking about this because there's a long list of benefits. And these are some of them. So I'm just going to run through this quickly. These networks, because they don't involve fossil fuels, are safe and clean. There's mainly water inside the pipes and nothing is burned. So there's no risk of explosions or toxic leaks. And the only emissions come from the electricity needed to run the pumps. They're also affordable and reliable. Once installed, customer bills can be low and predictable year-round. And we'll talk later about affording that upfront cost and how even that can be spread out over time and over a community to make it actually doable. These systems are also healthy. As I said, nothing's burned inside, so the indoor air is safer to breathe. and they're flexible, which is really important in Vermont because we live here because of the natural landscape. These systems can fit into that landscape in many locations with a minimal footprint. So the aesthetics of these systems is not such a big deal. They're also resilient and secure. The components are durable, long-lasting, and they're mainly underground or inside, so they're protected from a lot of different kinds of disruptions. They're also equitable because these networks offer a community scale solution rather than an individual choice based on what people can afford or what they can access. And it's not house by house. So we can move faster to bring clean energy to more people across a neighborhood. They can also be part of a just transition because fossil fuel workers, whether they work on the gas system or they deliver oil and propane, they're plumbers and pipe fitters, and they understand pipes underground and delivering fuel. So they can use the skills they already have to install these systems. In fact, one of the national trainers who came to Vermont to work with the workforce at Vermont Gas Systems, really by training them, found that their skills were almost identical to what's needed to install a ground source heat pump loop. And importantly, these are local systems. The energy comes from underground, under our feet, and around us in our communities. So we're not beholden to international energy markets and fluctuating prices, but it's right here, and it's a system that we can actually own and operate. So I want to show you some examples of what this looks like. This is something, this is a geothermal system up in Burlington at Hula Lakeside, and it's a larger system. It connects a couple of buildings. So this is a larger pipe than you might find in some places, but this is part of a geothermal loop. This is a list of the geothermal systems that I found out about so far that are already installed on the left-hand side and are coming online soon on the right. So I put in blue the ones that I think should be familiar to people on this call. So you have these systems near you, right where you live. And I can share my slides later so you can look at this more closely, but there's a lot of different kinds of buildings. The National Guard is out in front on this. The military is using this solution a lot. But there's also schools, municipal buildings, all kinds of public facilities, in addition to things like Beta Technologies and OnLogic businesses. So I also want to talk through some non-Vermont examples, because these systems have been operating for a bit longer and we've learned things about them that relate to what we need to know here. In Toronto, there is a new development that's been operating for about 2 years, of over 300 homes that are all connected through geothermal pipes. And they are expecting to reduce their emissions overall over time, once the whole thing is operational, by about 80%. 80% reduction in emissions. In Texas, where they do everything bigger, and I imagine this looks like what you don't want to see in Vermont, but is happening in Williston and South Burlington around me to some extent. There's a Texas development that is building out to be 7,500 homes, 2 million square feet of commercial space, and 3 schools. So it's growing to become that size. And they have a networked thermal system and solar. So remember Winter Storm Uri a while ago that knocked out power across Texas? Because they have local heating and cooling and the solar to run the system, they got back up on their feet very quickly and really were not impacted by the storm. So we can learn from that, the resiliency of that system. An ice rink in Vancouver provides heat and hot water to nearby buildings, about the equivalent of 43 homes from one ice rink, by sharing heat that's removed during the freezing process to make the ice. And another neighborhood in Vancouver is cutting greenhouse gas emissions from buildings in half by recovering heat from a wastewater treatment plant. And this mechanism in the middle is what is extracting the heat from those wastewater light green pipes and delivering it to nearby facilities, nearby homes. So to recap, network geothermal systems use ground source heat pumps and pipes to connect multiple buildings and provide heating, cooling, hot water, and thermal storage, importantly, for consistency. In addition, thermal energy networks do all of this, and they harness waste heat that already exists across a community, that's otherwise vented or lost, and that has already been generated and already paid for. So, for example, the waste heat from a large grocery store's refrigeration system can be reused to provide heat and hot water to about 15 to 30 homes. So combining geothermal with other thermal resources creates a stronger solution. And that's why I'm mainly talking about thermal energy networks and helping people understand that geothermal can be part of it, but really our goal is thermal energy networks of different kinds in different places. So by building thermal energy networks in town centers where we have the density and proximity, and in new construction where it makes total sense, we are harnessing local heat and can use the resources we already have to reduce building emissions hugely by approximately 80% or more. We can also keep energy dollars in our communities and keep customer bills predictable. And we can protect the electric grid as we accelerate the energy transition. So because TENS are so efficient to operate, the ground source heat pumps are using more moderate temperatures to create heating and cooling than an air source heat pump does on the very hottest or the very coldest days. Because they operate more efficiently, regardless of outside temperatures, they use less electricity, and the components last longer than other kinds of heat pumps. 25 years or more for the ground source heat pump, and a loop, the underground pipes, can last 50 years or more. So we can protect the electric grid by implementing this solution. We can decarbonize buildings without added grid load, making electrification go further, faster by reducing the demand from the thermal sector. So I want to emphasize this point, that thermal energy networks are a yes and solution. And what I mean by that is they're part of a portfolio of solutions that complement other clean energy solutions. So the yes part is that we need to implement house-by-house solutions like air source heat pumps as quickly as possible. We also can add thermal energy networks in new developments in town centers to help more people access and afford clean energy, and to add another way to heat and cool our homes, so mitigate risk by diversifying our thermal energy sources. And as I mentioned with the Texas development, we can pair systems with solar to supply local clean electricity needed to run the system, and it's essentially a mini grid. So I have one more example for you, and this is from Colorado, where they're really moving forward with thermal energy networks. Colorado Mesa University was one of the first systems to really get going with network geothermal, and they've been operating for over 12 years. And we have some really good data on what's going on there. So at this campus, they're heating and cooling 16 buildings and getting 90% of the energy required to operate their campus from this thermal network. They're also connecting 9 more buildings. That's how well it's working. Plus looking at adding nearby city buildings and high school facilities. Overall, this system is saving $1.5 million in energy costs a year, and you can see the reduced metric tons of carbon. The university has been able to lower tuition by 2% because of the energy savings. So this is the kind of opportunity that we're working on bringing to Vermont. So let's come back to Vermont. I've recently talked with the director of a municipal utility, a water and electric department in a small Vermont town. And he knows Vermont. He's been around for a while, and he's identified 4 themes that he hears a lot, and he calls them myths. So myth number 1, no one at the municipal level or in development knows how to install or manage this kind of thing. Well, actually, municipalities know how to lay pipes and manage energy flows. They know how to raise capital for larger projects and pay them back over time. So we already have a lot of what's needed. And the other point here is that thermal is actionable. It's within local and regional control rather than the build out of the electric grid really is not in our hands, but we can harness and use local heat. Myth number 2, thermal networks have to be big. Well, actually, they don't. They can be just 2 buildings sharing heat, like an ice arena near a high school, which is an actual project people are looking at in White River Junction, a hospital and adjacent senior housing complex, or a telecommunications facility next to a hotel. And here is that telecommunications facility in a Vermont town. And if you start there and you connect it to the senior housing development that is across the street, that is occupying that parking lot that used to be there, and then you can add the theater and other buildings nearby over time. Myth number 3, we can electrify everything. Well, I imagine people here are aware of the problems with that. In Vermont, some of the municipal utilities have told me that they will need to build the electric grid out 2.5 times the size it is now in order to meet the demands of electrifying everything. That's a big cost, and that's a big effort. Instead, we need to diversify our energy sources and use local heat where we can, so we can use electricity for what we really need to use it for. And myth number 4, our state is mostly rural. So here's downtown Rutland, which doesn't look very rural. There's actually already a lot of density in our town centers, and we need to create more because we need housing. And infill housing is a big focus right now. So there is a really big opportunity to not only dispel these myths, but use what we know to build thermal energy networks. And here's another thing about the opportunity we have in Vermont. What you see here in green is the gas system in Vermont. It's only in 3 counties, and it's only 55,000 customers. There are other states where the gas systems are huge and decrepit and run by investor-owned gas companies, and it's really hard to advance this system with them and through them. Instead, we have a lot of oil and propane across Vermont. And I used to be an oil and propane customer, and it really worries me thinking about what people have to pay now, because I think about what I had to pay then, and it was already a lot. So we have a really big opportunity. Over the next 10 to 17 years, we need to eliminate the use of about 9 million gallons of oil and propane per year, which just gives more strength to our mission to get thermal energy networks in Vermont where they make sense and where we can get them built. So what do we need to do in order to do this? Well, we need the workforce. Like all clean energy solutions, we need people to actually put them in. And that's a challenge in Vermont because you can't just have the workforce without being able to house people. So there are many layered issues there. And we are talking with Vermont Technical Centers. We are talking with Vermont Technical College. And we are also working with other people who are highly focused on the workforce situation. So I'm only touching on that this evening. We could talk about that more. I'd like to talk more about financing and policy. So financing, there are 2 main levels to this. On the federal level, as I imagine people here know, there are unprecedented levels of federal funding for clean energy. One thing about thermal energy networks is that we can maximize the Inflation Reduction Act. 30% tax incentives for these systems with a potential 10% more for domestic manufacture, which these systems mostly are. So then you can add on other things like low-income housing and other ways to harness the federal dollars. So in Vermont, we can optimize the utility model. So we can have existing utilities and municipal and other utilities implement these systems because they can access the upfront capital and spread out the cost to recover it in rates over time. The Vermont Bond Bank and Vermont Economic Development Authority are part of our team. They're up to speed on this and they're ready for projects to create financing for it. Public-private partnerships are also perfect for this because of the importance of heat for businesses and businesses that generate heat, like Cabot Cheese. They use heat to dry their whey. They have so much heat that they could share with buildings around them. And we're looking at that in Middlebury. Climate infrastructure financing, we're talking with the state treasurer, the Agency of Natural Resources, and the Department of Public Service, because they're all working together to figure out how to deploy federal funds in Vermont. And our local banking community has a history of supporting local projects. So there are lots of layers and lots of possibilities for how we can make these affordable. In terms of policy, we have a bill, H242, the Thermal Energy Networks Act, that's modeled on the successful bill that passed last year in New York. In New York, they had pipe fitters, environmentalists, and utilities working together to pass this bill. We took that bill and we made it fit Vermont, because we're not making gas companies do these projects. We are allowing existing utilities to do this by getting the PUC to authorize them to do it. Also, businesses like the larger fuel oil delivery companies could, if they applied to the PUC to become a thermal energy network utility, they could transition their business into providing thermal energy, not through fossil fuels, but through water and pipes. Also, co-ops, nonprofits, community organizations, they could also use the utility model through this bill. Because, as I said, a thermal energy utility would be able to access the capital needed upfront and then recover those upfront costs through rates that are reasonable for customers over time, and even receive a return on the investment. Now, municipalities in that are treated differently in that bill, because municipalities are regulated locally already through the democratic process, and they already operate infrastructure locally. So municipalities are allowed to do this, but without having any kind of state oversight. So it really paves the way for municipalities to go ahead and implement thermal energy networks. And this is my last slide, just to say that we all know living in Vermont, heat is a precious resource. We have the heat we need, and we also, through thermal energy networks, have the opportunities to harness it. And I end with this picture. It's Middlebury, it's not Woodstock or Quechee, but I really like the way the headlights here can help us imagine an underground pipe system that's distributing energy, moving heat around our community. So I'll leave you with that, and I look forward to hearing your questions and comments both.
Thank you so much, Debbie. So we are going to be taking questions in the chat. So if you have questions, please enter them into the chat. And if you haven't used that before, at the bottom of your screen, there are 3 little dots you can click on, and it will show you how to get to the chat window there, and you can type your questions in. All right.
And while people are doing that, I can put some links in the chat to resources that we have on our website. We have 2 short videos, and we are collecting more and more 1- and 2-pagers on different aspects of these systems. So you can take a look at our fact sheets page, and we also have an FAQ. So I'll drop those links in the chat.
So we have a comment I can read. The cost of creating these systems likely is tied to the type of rock under the buildings. Bedrock is harder to drill through than sand, for example. Is there a resource to understand the underlying near-surface geology and the related costs for creating such system?
Yeah, great question about geology. So what I've learned about this is that bedrock is a great thermal conductor. In other words, you want bedrock because it's going to help you move heat from underground up to the buildings. Now, bedrock can eat up a drill bit, I've been told, and so there are costs associated with drilling into bedrock. Sand is harder and can be more expensive because you have to create a casing around the borehole, and that is what also can be expensive. So, whenever you talk with a driller or an engineer about this, they say, it depends. And that's very frustrating, but it's also true. So part of doing these systems is having someone assess exactly what you're looking at in terms of buildings, the thermal loads, and thermal energy resources, and also assessing the potential for drilling. I've been talking with a Vermont state geologist about this, and he's working with one of our prominent drilling companies to create a map of Vermont. In other words, well, there are already geological maps of Vermont and all sorts of layers you can find on the state website. But we are hoping to have a simpler map that can show people where the go and go zones are according to drillers, because drillers know Vermont drillers know Vermont like the back of their hand. So they can quickly identify where they would consider drilling or where it would be more expensive or too expensive. So talking to a driller is a good idea. And we can talk more about when that might be a good idea.
Great, thank you. So Ginevra asks, what is the best way for a municipality to learn about geothermal? Is there a person or entity who can come to a town to advise on opportunities?
Thank you for that question. So I can obviously take it only so far, which is about the information that I shared this evening plus. But I am working with a few different people to do this. There isn't an official Vermont place that can go around and help municipalities with this. I'm talking with the state treasurer about creating some such entity to support these projects or having it be a program within the state somehow. However, I'm working with a nonprofit that is a thermal energy network development firm, and they can look at Google Earth maps and not even have to be there and give you a general idea of what you might be looking at. There are also some manufacturers involved. So Shark Energy does a lot of the wastewater heat recovery systems. And I know that a representative from that company has been up in Vermont and looking at some places. In fact, was just here yesterday looking around and can advise. And then also some of the manufacturers like Water Furnace, they make ground source heat pumps. They're talking with me and with Vermont ski areas about recovering heat from snowmaking ponds and using those in the base lodges and resort buildings. So there are also third parties or private companies that can be turnkey companies. They can come in and look around and do everything you need. They can finance it. They can help you finance it. They can also own and operate it. Some of those companies are like Subterra Renewables from Canada, Celsius Energy. So there are some companies that will come in and do everything. They are for-profit companies, and I don't have experience working with them myself.
So Geo asks, I guess I don't understand some basics. Where is the heat coming from in a simple home or residential setup? I understand in winter the earth is warmer than the air, but not nearly warm enough to heat a home, correct?
Yes. So the water in the pipes picks up that about 50 degrees temperature and brings it up to your ground source heat pump. And the heat pump extracts the heat from that and delivers that heat into your home through ducts or whatever the indoor system is. Especially radiant floor heating works very well with that. It also extracts cold air and sends that back underground. So it's very much like an air source heat pump, it's just using water. And it's all about the compression of a moderate temperature into heating or cooling as needed. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but that's, and I'm happy to hear follow-up questions, but that's my best explanation, non-technical.
Brian asks, is there an easily accessible information sheet that lays out the financial case for geothermal? You mentioned the IRA and 30% direct pay for municipalities. Excellent. In my community, it would be important to build a financial case.
Yes. So yes, it's important to build a financial case. No, I'm not aware of any one pager or simple resource on that. There is a section in the toolkit that I mentioned coming out that includes a summary of what's available through the IRA, what the basic 30% covers, and then what the bonuses are and requirements to get those bonuses. So there is that's going to be available soon. Beyond that, it's pretty project specific and would depend on what you want to accomplish and what the local resources are and how the state is deploying the federal funds. So I just want to reiterate that the bond bank is available to talk about municipal systems. VEDA, or Vermont Economic Development Authority, works on commercial and business related systems. And sometimes they might have to work together because it involves both. And Vermont Housing Finance Agency or Authority, VHFA, would concern itself with housing projects. So I believe they're willing to work together if a network includes 2+ of those kinds of buildings. I'm happy to talk more about financing if you have more questions or if I didn't adequately address what you wanted to know.
Great. So Brian also asks or says, you alluded to fossil fuel distributors who might be wanting to make the shift to providing a geothermal network as a new product offering. What companies in Vermont are on record as wanting or doing this?
Great question. I've spoken with Borns. I used to be a Borns customer, and they're interested. And we've spoken several times with Matt Coda, who is essentially the head of the Vermont Fuel Dealers Association, and we have another call with him next week. And the main idea is to get in front of their members, so do a presentation to the Fuel Dealers Association and go from there. But that's as far as we've been able to get. I listened to all of the testimony of the fuel dealers for the Affordable Heat Act in the Senate Natural Resources Committee because I wanted to learn what their issues are. And I worked with gas workers in Massachusetts for many years. So it's not the same, but I'm really interested in what it will take to help them understand that this could be a way for them to evolve their businesses and keep quality jobs for their workers. So we're working on it. We've made some headway.
Ben asks, is there a best way to future prep these systems for further growth? As you might have heard in the intro, we are voting soon on a new middle and high school in town, and geothermal is being seriously considered as the main heating and cooling system. It would likely be far too complicated for this community to plan beyond that one project on the school design and build timeline, but there could be great potential to eventually extend a network from the new middle school and high school along Route 4 to some other local businesses and residences. But we would want to know what to do with the initial school system design to make it easy to tie into a network down the road.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up because that's about how do you build a network? How do you start small and make it bigger over time? That is really the province of an engineer. What I know is that you can do that. And it's really good if you can be planning ahead and saying, this is phase 1, this is what we can do now. And here's phase 2, and phase 3 goes over here. We're doing that in Middlebury. There's a group of people that are looking at the Middlebury Inn and the Middlebury Co-op, if you're familiar with that. And then they're looking a little beyond that to the Shaw's grocery store in the residential area near that. So we have big dreams there, and we're starting with 2 buildings. But an engineer would know about how to size the system appropriately for what you have now and make it able to connect.
Ginevra asks, I wanted to go back to what you said at the beginning, that Billings and Woodstock Inn are using geothermal. Is that correct?
I would say it's correct as far as I've heard from the man who engineered and designed them, whose name is George Martin, and he's the president of LN Consulting, like the letter L and the letter N. LN Consulting. They're in Burlington, Vermont, and Northampton, Massachusetts. And he does a lot of the work. For example, Burlington High School, he's designing the geothermal there for that new building.
And Ginevra would love their contact info.
Okay, I would just say, I would say Google LN Consulting and be in touch with them that way. That's all right. he has other people who work with him, Ian and other people on his team. It's hard to hear back from George because he's so busy. So it might be good to talk to someone else in his office.
Thank you, Debbie. Does anyone else have any last questions for Debbie?
Or comments about what you're looking at when you're looking around Woodstock, Queechee. Any thoughts or reflections are welcome too.
And while we're waiting to see if anyone has any last thoughts, I'll just add, again, for those of you who came in a little after the beginning of our talk, our next green drinks will be on the new proposed net zero school building in Woodstock, and that will be on January 18th. And I hope you all can join us for that discussion. All right, well, thank you so much for joining us, Debbie, for all that great information. That was really informative. Oh, good. We've got one more question here from Jean. What kind of changes are required in existing buildings to transition to net?
Or tens, maybe you mean, Jean, I don't know. Networked. Net stands for networked. Good question. And here again, we're with that old phrase, it depends. On the fact sheet page on my website, I put the link in the chat already, and I can do that again. We have a new fact sheet that is a list of HVAC equipment, heating, ventilation, air conditioning equipment, indoor equipment that is compatible with a 10, things that would need some retrofitting, and things that actually would have to go, have to be ripped out in order to make way for a new system that could work. So there are terms in there that I don't understand that I heard from our experts, and you may need to talk with an HVAC installer in order to fully understand it. But we do have a list of what works, what sort of works if you tweak it, and then what really doesn't work.
Ben wants to share some half-baked thoughts. We are developing a mixed-use residential commercial site in the east end of Woodstock, and we'd love to work with Sustainable Woodstock and the Vermont Community Geothermal Alliance to consider how to start building out a system like this here in the village.
Yes. I love half-baked thoughts, and I'd love to help you cook it.
Love it. Thank you.
Baking is one of my favorite things to do, but I'd love to follow up with you, Ben, and I'll put my work email in the chat. Anyone else also is welcome to be in touch with me, Debbie@vcga.net.
Lovely. Thank you, Debbie.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things to do, is to meet with people who know their communities and know what's most important to them locally in terms of cutting emissions or saving money or whatever it is, and figure out what can work.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight, Debbie, and for sharing all of this great information. We'll also send out these links in the follow-up email, as well as a recording if you missed the beginning of our talk tonight. And thank you all so much for joining us. Hope to see you in January.
Could I just add?
Oh, of course.
I want to thank you all so much. Really appreciate this opportunity, and all of your comments and questions are fantastic. And your thanks as well, because this work is not easy, as I'm sure many of you know, because you do your own parts of this work. We're doing this together, and it's really helpful. It's really energizing to come and talk to you about it and hear your enthusiasm and your support for it.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Debbie.
Great. Thanks. I hope to talk with some of you later.
Absolutely. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Have a good night. Bye-bye.